Okay,
Okay.
okay, thanks.
Happy to see you.
Mhm. Oh, this is decent, I think.
I mean, yeah, for a Wednesday and a Delta variant pandemic. For a Wednesday and a Delta variant pandemic, I think
Yeah.
so. And not in North Beach. Huh? For Byron, I think. It's the right idea. Is it in my teeth?
They're perfect.
I got it all over the page. I thought about wearing my watch or
You
just
want my
having it
watch?
here. Can we just set it here?
Mhm.
That'll be much better than my phone. And then we won't have to bother Byron. Thanks, Judy. Oh, hey, this is yours. It's signed and everything.
It's paid for.
The author, of course.
Well, I got something for the author
Oh.
too.
Yay.
How nice.
Good to see you. It's been like
No
a year.
kidding. Yeah, it's good to see you too.
I heard about Jack. Oh my god, so sad.
Yeah,
I just saw the article and I was just like, no way. I just thought he'd live forever.
yeah, yeah, we all did. Yeah.
Okay, I'll bring the seat.
Now these seats are rather taking up the aisle. No way we can get you in some comfy seats? Sure. Do you want us to stand right there? Well, let's see. He's there. That one has a person seat. So we got one on either side of you. Could you shift it? Let's share it that way. There's
Andrew.
two seats right there. And I'm going to pull these back. I don't mind. See, we're still friends.
Wait, okay, so he said about 40.
Andrew? Andrew Coteau? Oh, oh. I said that because of Joshua.
Yeah, yeah. That could happen. Yeah.
That's nice.
You're nice. I am.
All right. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
I'm the first row.
All right, the introduction of the introduction. Byron will be right up. I don't think you're hearing this.
Diane. I bought this because I thought Judy might like it.
I do. I like it a lot.
How does it sound? That's a little loud. How's that? That's better, right? Yeah. Okay. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I give you Byron Spooner. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Bird and Beckett. I want to particularly thank, before I forget, to thank Eric for hosting this. And I want to thank everyone here tonight and all of our friends out there in TV land or wherever it is that with the Zoom, et cetera, et cetera.
In the last year or so, Judy and I have been doing some small-scale publishing. And the book she's going to read from tonight is the third book we've done under the Andover Street Archives Press imprint. And we have 2 more in the pipeline. And we'll probably have similar events like this for when those books come out. This is the current one. This is Judy's book. Hooray. So tonight, Judy, our guests are Judith and Bernhard and Silvi Alcivar. And I think that most of you already know that, Judy is a writer, a publisher, and a cultural influencer here in San Francisco. Yeah, isn't that cool? A cultural influencer. I thought of that. I thought of that myself. She's the founder and past board chair of Marin Poetry Center and a member of the Revolutionary Poets Brigade. Yay, let's hear it. Her work has been widely anthologized. She's the author of Prisoners of Culture, which was published by C.C. Marimbo Press in 2014. Her latest book is Marriages, which I just showed you. Silvi Alcivar is a poet, a speaker, and a typewriter lover. Yes. She's been the owner of the Poetry Store for over 20 years. During that time, she's written thousands of poems. Should I say tens of thousands?
Yeah, 12 years. I'm not that old.
Oh, okay. 12 years. And she'll be our host tonight, leading our conversation with Judy. So please welcome Judith Ann Bernhard and Silvi Alcivar.
Thank you, Byron. It is such a pleasure to be here. As I said to Judy while things were getting set up, it feels like a family affair, which is quite lovely. So for those of you who don't know, Judy and I met some 12 years ago when I was writing poems outside at a street fair where Byron was selling books. And Judy offered me some sarsaparilla tea. She also asked for a poem. She was a bit taken, but also a bit skeptical, and our friendship began there. And I say a family affair because Judy's often trying to adopt me as her daughter, but I always refuse. So Judy, tell us, this collection is quite delightful, and for those of you who know Judy and who've read it know that it's very Judy. What can you say for those who haven't read it in a sentence or so about what the collection's about?
Well, it's about marriages.
And what inspired this work, Judy?
Well, I think that throughout my writing life, I have always been interested in power, in relationships, and who holds power in a relationship and how it is maintained. And so I think that this kind of morphed into these little stories about marriages. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. Would you read the first story for us?
All right. Here we go. This one is the first one because it's kind of archetypical. And it's also probably the most romantic story in the entire book. Jean went into the garage to ask her husband a question. He was leaning over the fender of a cherry 57 Chevy Bel Air. The hood was up, and his hands, which Jean assumed were covered in grease, were hidden from view because he was using some tool on the engine. She considered his rear end and thought it still looked pretty good. She wondered how many times through the many years they'd been together she'd approached him from this direction and was treated to this exact view. He had always been working on cars, his own or someone else's, from the time that model Chevy was the favorite of his high school friends. Then it had been about 10 years old. Now it was a classic. Then a guy looked at the ads in the paper, got someone to drive him to where there was a car for sale, and talked the owner into letting him have it for $50. Now they went for around 30 grand. Then a lot of teenage boys knew how to keep a Chevy running. Now Jean's husband, the father of their 3 adult children and 4 grandchildren, was one of the few guys who was still fooling around with old cars. Jean felt a little stab of tenderness. She supposed it was an impulse toward nostalgia for the boy he'd been so long ago. The boy her friends thought looked like a James Dean character. His pants were always a little too short. They called them floods. And in spite of everything that she'd done to try to persuade him otherwise, he always wore white athletic socks and a white round-neck T-shirt that showed beneath his half-unbuttoned plaid shirt. He hadn't been the kind of guy her friends dated. He didn't play sports, didn't have a leather sweater to drape around her shoulders on a chilly night. He didn't run for class president, didn't join the drama club or any club. He was, in fact, the star of nothing. But he treated her like a princess, like the delicate flower she was not. And he was extraordinarily reliable. He never failed to turn up when expected. He was taciturn but agreeable, and it was impossible to pick a fight with him. Was it any wonder she'd married him? He finished tightening whatever he had been tightening and turned around and looked up at her. He favored her for the millionth time with his slow grin. He said, "Did you bring me a cup of coffee?" "No," she said, "but I will." "Come here," he said, in imitation of himself from decades past. "Come and give us a little kiss." "You're ridiculous," she said, as she moved toward him. "You love it," he said, nuzzling her neck. "Yes, I do," she said.
He was, in fact, the star of nothing. I love that. Judy, tell us, so that's the first story in the collection, but was it the first one you wrote?
No. I actually don't know in what order they were written. A dear friend of mine, Jody Weiner, helped me put the stories in order once I had collected everything I wanted to put in the book. And I honestly don't remember in what order they were written.
So tell us what you learned about yourself and your own marriage in working through this. What are you the star of, Judy?
I'm the star of Byron's heart. That's excuse me. That's about my starring role these days. I've tried to think about what I learned about my marriage. I don't know. It's very difficult to say. I mean, marriage, it's a long road. Byron and I have been together for a long time, and our relationship is waxed and waned and grown and shrunk, and it's I guess that what you learn from making a collection like this is that that's what happens in a marriage, especially one that endures.
Yeah. So you and Byron have been married for somewhat 30-something years now?
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely recognize some of the details in this may have been inspired by your marriage. And also that the women in the book have names beginning with J. There's also the thing about being ambivalent about salad. When you're writing, are you purposefully taking inspiration from things in real life? Does it just happen to happen? And can you talk about the process of fictionalizing the truth or not?
Actually, I'd like very much to talk about this. And I'd like to hope that my dear brother is watching, because he and I have gone around and around. I wonder if other fiction writers have the same feeling that I do when people tell them that they recognize the characters. Because it's so annoying. It's what I want to say to my brother and to all of you, whether you write fiction or not, is that all of it is true and all of it is made up. All of the characters are me. Flaubert said, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. And that's what I can tell you, that although I'm garrulous one-on-one, in general, in a crowd, you will see that I don't say much. Because ever since I was a kid, I have always sat in the corner. When I was a kid, it was where the adults were, and listened to what other people were saying, tried to figure out what people were doing, what they were feeling, how their words related to their emotions. And so this is from a long time of observing other human beings. And you never know exactly where it comes from. Mm-hmm. I mean, anyone will tell you this. Even Bob Dylan says this. You don't know exactly where it comes from, but I would say from observation. And then you shape the story around the emotion that you want to describe, or the particular outcome that you want. And I like to tell people, especially the people who say, "Oh, I recognize your second husband in that one." You know, I like to say it's all made up.
Fair enough. Well, let's hear the all made up story about the gas station. Which absolutely has nothing to do with something that happened to Byron in real life.
Jory couldn't stand it when her husband hurt himself. This was particularly unfortunate since he frequently banged into things or cut himself on improbable objects. It had been suggested to her that the source of his trouble was the fact that he was a lefty in a righty world. She wasn't sure if this accounted for his accident-prone life. It wasn't something they ever talked about. She always felt reluctant to bring up the subject of his unlucky scrapes and bruises. She thought it might seem she was blaming him for something over which he apparently had little control. What kind of person would hurt themselves if they could prevent it? Also, deep inside, she always wondered if there wasn't something wrong with her. What kind of person wouldn't find compassion for a beloved mate who was in pain? She wondered why she didn't feel sympathy instead of annoyance. One day she asked her husband to come with her to a gas station. The light that told you to check your tires had lit up on her Toyota's dashboard, and she wanted him to put air in her tires if need be. She drove up to the little kiosk where air and water were available. He hopped out of the passenger seat and pulled the air hose toward the rear of the car. The next thing she knew, a teenage boy was knocking on the window saying, "Lady, lady, your husband hurt himself." She thought, what else is new? But then the boy said, "Do you want me to call an ambulance?" That got her out of the car in a hurry. Her husband was lying flat on his back on the pavement. His lip was bleeding and his cracked glasses were hanging off of his nose. He was moaning. Jory helped her husband up and put him back in the car. She spit on a tissue she found in her purse and cleaned some of the blood from his face. She handed him a second tissue and told him to apply pressure to his lip to staunch the flow. He explained he was pulling on the air hose when, for no discernible reason, it jumped out of his hand, hit him in the head, broke his glasses, and knocked him down. "I'll drive you to the emergency room," she said sourly. It was late on a Sunday morning, and for once the ER wasn't crowded. The admitting nurse ushered Jory and her husband into a room right away, and a woman who looked far too young to be a doctor, but introduced herself as Dr. Patel, entered and began ministering to the patient. She shined a light in his eyes and listened to his story. She touched his face and made little cooing noises. Jory couldn't help but notice the woman was attractive, and she wondered if this so-called doctor wasn't skirting the edges of professionalism. Nevertheless, that was Jory's wake-up call. As she watched the female physician fuss over her husband, she realized there were probably plenty of women in the world who would gladly show sympathy, even fake sympathy, for him when he hurt himself. She made up her mind then and there to have a little heart when it came to his mishaps. She wasn't going to question his discomfort ever again. She wasn't going to show her distaste when she handed him bandages anymore, and she wasn't going to worry about whether or not there was something wrong with her. She was simply going to do her part to preserve her happy home, and that's what she did. So, this mishap in a gas station parking lot with the air hose did happen to a certain guy. But it didn't end the way I've made the story end. And that's just what I kind of wanted to point out in this regard, because I didn't go into the room where the doctor was and observe the doctor administering medical help to him. I just made that up so that I could have a happy ending to the story. And in truth, in point of fact, I have to tell you that I have not really stopped being annoyed when a certain person hurts himself. If it's not too bad, then I'm suitably annoyed.
One of the things I really love about you and your work, Judy, is that it is definitely, there is an honesty and there is also an attention to the sort of everyday of life, and the honesty really comes through in those things. And it's also an attention to togetherness that comes from years and years of it. There is an attention too in that to the internal as well as the external of marriage and of life. It's this, I hear it in your poems, I hear it in your essays, and to me, it's like a very Judy attention. I was wondering, are you thinking about the balance of that internal and external and of those details when you're writing, or is it just something that has now kind of become your way of Judying on the page?
Well, I think, Silvi, really, that for me to claim that I am aware of balancing internal and external when I'm making these little stories would be, a lie, just simply a lie. I think that what happens with me is that I have certain things that I've learned through writing, through studying, and mostly through doing the writing that I myself have internalized. Certainly, my understanding of dialogue and the uses of dialogue in a story is something that is very deep in me and very practiced. But as far as being aware of it in an intellectual way, I can't claim that. I don't think that maybe if I tell you a little bit about my process, for years, 20 years, since we're throwing that number around, I was part of a writing group, and we wrote together every Thursday morning. And we free wrote. We followed the precepts of an old hippie book, Writing Without Teachers, by a man named Peter Elbow, who is the man named for two body parts. And so we free wrote. We also presented each other with finished work that we critiqued. But we also free wrote for 40 minutes every week. And I think that these little stories come from 40-minute free writes. And so there is a structure that I have in my head just from practice. And I think that's what shapes them, if I can say that anything is shaping them.
That makes a lot of sense to me. There is a quality of the momentness, in the way that your voice. It doesn't have a very, sometimes you read things and there's just this sort of a thickness to it, and you have to spend some time going over a sentence again and again. And your work isn't like that to me. It has the quality of a free write in it in the best way. I think the therapist story also does a good job of illustrating the dialogue and then the internal, external thing that I'm talking about. So will you read the therapist story? It was one of my favorites, mostly because I've spent a lot of time in therapy.
It's been a rough couple of months, Jane said. I was sick, and then I was sick again, and then I was sick again. The therapist said, "How did that make you feel?" Sick. The therapist thought, "I'm sick too, sick of hearing how sick you've been." She said, "Were you bedridden?" Bedridden is an interesting word, isn't it? It's like it comes from another time, a time when women were treated for hysteria, when they fainted. "Did you say you fainted?" "Oh, never mind," Jane said. They sat in silence for a little while, each of them exploring their thoughts about the other one. Jane thought, "My God, this woman is slow on the uptake. She has no feel for figurative language at all. She's actually sort of a dolt. And isn't that a great word, dolt?" The therapist thought, "She always tries to wiggle out of things by calling my attention to language. I guess it's no accident she's written 4 bestsellers and 2 of them were made into movies. Is it unethical to ask her what Brad Pitt is really like?" The therapist asked Jane what kind of week she'd had. "A dark time. I was sick and thinking only of myself and entertaining grudges against my friends and my entire family. I hated everything and everybody, and when I tried to cheer myself up by getting out of bed, I relapsed." "Did you go to the doctor?" "No, I called her and she specifically told me not to come to her office. She said to stay in bed and drink plenty of fluids and that in time I would get better, and blah, blah, blah." The therapist decided not to take the bait. She thought, if you respond to this, her next move will be to blame you because you're a doctor, and her doctor is a doctor, although not the same kind of doctor, and she will imply that you are in league with one another. This is one you can't win." They sat in silence again for a little while. Finally, the therapist said, "How are you getting along with your husband?" "Oh, he left for Italy. He went to see his mother, who is going to fill his head with the idea that the life he and I have together is empty and meaningless because we don't have children. She will tell him, she always does, that he should leave me and find a younger woman who can give him children." "How does that make you feel?" "Sick," Jane said. "It makes me feel sick."
So, Judy, this book is called Marriages. And when I asked you what it's about, you said marriages, which we obviously think about traditional marriage between two people, courthouse, all of that. But it occurs to me that these stories are about marriage in a broader sense. The marriage of relationships, that we have to a therapist, that we have to a friend, that we have to a stranger's dog, even to the ideas that we have about ourselves and about each other. There's a lot in here about identity and about judgment. I really love the story of Eric being Erica, and think it speaks to this point I'm making. And I'm wondering, were you thinking about these other kinds of marriages when you were writing the book and coming up with the stories, or again, am I intellectualizing something that you weren't really thinking about?
Well, I mean, everybody writes about love. What does Chuck Berry said? If you are not now in love, you have been in love, or you will soon be in love. So everybody writes about love and relationships and our ties that bind us to one another. And I think that that has just always interested me, not only as a writer, but just as an observer. Mm-hmm. And it's a hard question, Silvi. I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Would you like to read one of your favorite stories for us?
Yes, I would. Here's a story that's my favorite story, actually. It took place, let me find it. She didn't prepare me for this business. And this, I want to give you a piece of advice, which is that if you ever publish a book of little stories, give them titles so you can have a table of contents. Because this makes it very hard to find.
Sorry, I gave you a hard question, and I thought I'd give you an easy one by saying favorite
Yeah,
story. But
yeah. All right, here's one. Let me see. Okay. Okay. All right, I'll give you this one. When we were still significant others, my husband and I agreed our relationship would be semi-exclusive. It was his idea and I went along with it. Out of sight, out of mind, I thought. There were some ground rules. Number 1, no fooling around with close friends or relatives. He wasn't allowed to sleep with my sister. His fraternity brothers were off limits to me. Number 2, I always thought this was the same as number 1. Don't do anything that would become public or embarrass the other person. Number 3, don't fall in love. I asked him about the third rule. Why would you have an affair with someone you weren't in love with? He said, I'm talking about something that might happen with an attractive stranger on a train. Someone you couldn't resist, but you would never see again. I never go anywhere on a train, I said. Time passed, and to no one's surprise, we got married. We were very compatible. We liked the same things and the same people. We always wanted to have sex, more often than I did. But that wasn't anything new for me in a relationship. He wasn't pushy about it, and we had a good time when we did hook up. Our life together fell into a rhythm that suited both of us. By mutual agreement, we didn't have any children. We pursued our careers instead, and so we had a lot of disposable income. Everything was working out well, and I was content. If he was up to anything extracurricular, it wasn't apparent. Maybe he was just incredibly discreet. But there were never any unexplained absences, no lipstick on his collar, no MASH notes hidden in his pockets. Since playing detective never garnered me anything, I sort of forgot about our semi-exclusive deal. So, it didn't happen on a train. It did happen while I was traveling for work. I met Jonah on a plane to Chicago. It wasn't full, and there was an empty seat between us, which was nice. We exchanged pleasantries and soon learned we were headed to the same conference and staying at the same hotel. Of course, I noticed Jonah was good-looking right away, but he wasn't really my type. He was sort of dark and broody, a Mediterranean with a 5 o'clock shadow. He was beautifully dressed, and he smelled very faintly of aftershave. His hands were small and well cared for. He wore a thick gold wedding band, but somehow we never got around to talking about our spouses. The thing was the way he looked at me when I was speaking. He gave me his full attention. I have heard sexual attraction described as electricity, and I always thought that was pretty corny. There and then, I thought it was entirely apt. If some romance writer had described him, she would have said his dark brown eyes became deep pools. We had been talking for about an hour when I realized I was being seduced. It took me about another 20 minutes to mentally review my semi-exclusive deal and decide Jonah was my stranger on a train. And this really is where the story ends. We spent 2 nights and the better part of 3 days in bed. It was the best sex I ever had in my life. He taught me to like things I'd never even imagined doing. He told me what he wanted, and it gave me pleasure to please him. When we kissed goodbye at the airport, he said, "Same time next year?" And we both laughed. I went back to my happy home, and I never saw Jonah again.
What is it that you like so much about that story, Judy? And I will say it may or may not have been inspired by conversations we've had of my dating life where everyone is polyamorous and ethically non-monogamous in San Francisco.
Well, of course, it's beguiling that the marriage endures. I think that's what I like about it, that part of it. And the fact that it was fun to describe the seducer, that was a lot of fun. But again, you have what is basically a happy ending.
Yep. When I read that story, I was thinking about how you once told me that what I need to write about is sex. And I'll just leave that to you. I haven't gotten there yet. Are there any stories that almost didn't make it in?
Yes. I chose one. It's the kind of postmodern story that I was writing in the early 80s, perhaps. Is the kind of story that I was writing when I went to Stanford to study writing and the American short story. And it's got kind of a feel of that time to it. Let me see, where is it? Yeah. Um, it's got a obvious structure that I would never dream of writing a story like this now, except apparently I did. Juliet had noticed when she suggested a trip to the Museum of Modern Art, he hesitated. In the short time they'd known one another, he demonstrated an eagerness to fall in with anything she wanted them to do together. It had felt a little strange to insist on the museum as a destination, but it was still so early in their relationship, she hadn't had the experience with him to pick up on his signal. She only realized her mistake later. Let's start with how they met. Online, although they quickly discovered they knew a lot of people in common, and one of their friends had once suggested they were perfect for each other, and they should submit themselves to a blind date. When they saw one another's posts, they'd realized they weren't exactly strangers. This seemed an auspicious beginning. These were what Juliet thought of as bonus points. He was exactly her type, tall and slim, with a light olive complexion, dark hair, and a dark, neatly trimmed beard. By her standards, he was more than a little good-looking. He seemed to be financially stable. He worked for a big nonprofit concerned with environmental issues, a socially conscious job. He appeared to have enough money. She'd stayed at his place overnight twice, so she knew he was an unselfish lover. In fact, she rated him high on a personal scale, say an 8 out of 10. She figured his number would go up once they really got to know one another. Here were the demerits. He wasn't entirely reliable. He'd already called her at the last minute 3 times to say he was too busy to see her. He didn't find many opportunities to praise her. Juliet liked a little more fawning than he seemed willing to commit to. She wondered if she could get used to that. On the day they went to MoMA, she was still thinking the pluses were outweighing the minuses with this guy. It was a weekday morning, and she got to the museum just as it opened. There would be plenty of room to look at the art. It probably hadn't helped that she'd started crying almost as soon as they walked in the door. The Matisse, Dance 1, with the figures in a circle, exuding joy, always affected her. She didn't always cry, but that day she did. She wasn't sobbing or anything, but he saw the tears rolling down her cheeks. "What in God's name is wrong?" he said. Something about the "in God's name" made it worse. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just affected by the painting. I love it." He said, "Oh." As they moved through the museum, he remained unmoved. He found the Impressionist work fuzzy. He thought action painting was emblematic of inaction, and he laughed when Juliet told him that Jackson Pollock's drip paintings were influenced by the devastation of World War II. He refused to believe anyone's life had been altered by viewing Picasso's La Demoiselle d'Avignon. He told her Guernica could have been painted by a child, and he didn't see any value in reproducing the label on a can of soup. They argued, and they both became heated. She called him a Philistine. He called her a snob. It was their last date. They began playing phone tag, and eventually they both gave up on one another. A year or so later, when somebody told Juliet that he'd married and his wife was pregnant, she had to wonder if she'd missed her opportunity there. There was so much about him that had been so right. Juliet never married, and although she had a full life with lots of friends and lovers and an absorbing career, she always thought of him as the one who got away.
I found that story kind of haunting, Judy. Perhaps because it speaks to a truth maybe all of us know, right? If you just hadn't gone to the museum that day, would it have been different? This book is dedicated to your dear friend Marie Dern. I was wondering if you'd like to say anything about her, and also to ask, do you think friendship is a kind of marriage?
Oh, absolutely. Friendship is one of the true marriages. If it lasts, if it endures, and even when things go wrong in a friendship, or we lose people for one reason or another, death or whatever, there's a loss, although we always keep people in our hearts. What was the question?
You answered it pretty well there. The second part of it was if you'd like to say anything about Marie.
Oh, indeed, indeed. Well, Marie Dern was a wonderful woman. She was a printer. She belonged to a group of women who came up in the 70s. Most of them came out of Mills College, and she became a letterpress, fine press printer, and she also did some publishing. She and her friend, our mutual friend, Jane Downs, had a small publishing company for a while, and when I was writing these together, she's the one who brought me into the writing group, where the women were so accomplished and so serious that it was a big influence on my writing and my approach to art and life. So as we continued to meet together after there was some attrition in the group, people died, people moved away or did other things, and we continued to meet with a few other women, Jane Downs, who I mentioned, and Julia Hawkins, and also Ann Goldsmith. And so we continued to write together on Thursday mornings. And when this emerged, this book started emerging, Marie said, "This will make a great little book. This will be a wonderful book." And so she encouraged me to continue in this vein. And naturally, we had always assumed that she was going to create the book. But she died before I got the stories finished and all collected. So that's why the book is dedicated to her. Big influence.
Yeah, beautiful. Will you talk about the art that's on the cover?
Oh, I'd like to, yes. This is it's by my friend, Mary Conrad, who is a wonderful artist. And let me see, it says here what it is. It's called Winding Sheet, Oil on Vellum, Watercolor Paper, Embroidery Thread, courtesy of the artist. So you can see that this is the embroidery thread here. And Mary herself explained to me that she felt that this is an alphabet, that she created this as an alphabet. And I was looking through some of her artwork, and I saw this, and I knew immediately that this was it. And I worked with some designers in Los Angeles, Conflux Press, and they put it together to make the cover of the book. I'm really very happy with it. I hope people like it.
What are you working on now, Judy?
Well, I don't like to give too much away. I want you to be excited to see what I come up with next. I can tell you that they are short pieces that have a genesis in this style that works so well for me. I can tell you that it will be different in the fact that there are characters that will move from story to story. It's unlike in this book where there's nothing is repeated. This thing, I'm expecting that it's going to be about the same size, and that it's also going to come from free writes. Now that I've been having success with this book, I think that I found my métier in this kind of story, and so that's what I'm doing.
Wonderful. I'm glad I didn't say what I know about it then.
Yeah.
Help you keep that secret. I'm a good friend. Can you tell us where we can get this book for those who are out in TV land?
Yes. They can get it on Amazon or ABE. Or Byron, is the website extant? No, not yet. So Amazon or ABE. You can get one from Eric here. He's going to have a few copies here at Bird and Beckett. And you can also email us if you know how to do that. And put a $20 bill in an envelope and send it to me, and I'll send you a book.
Or just send you $20.
Yes.
Sounds like a pretty good deal.
Yes.
Would you like to read another story before we go to a Q&A?
All right. What have we got left here? Oh, my goodness. Did we do them all?
Not even close.
Oh, I know what I want. This is the most popular story in the book. This is my greatest hit. This is it. Mary Jane liked to make soup. She had already known how to make many different kinds of soup when she got married, and since then she'd taken every opportunity to search out new recipes. There was something in her that found the making of a good soup very appealing. Her husband liked to watch her make soup. He liked to eat her soup too, but his real interest was in seeing her prepare the potage, as he liked to say. If he saw her reaching for a cookbook or digging through the shoebox where she kept recipes she'd clipped from newspapers and magazines, he focused his attention on her. He enjoyed looking at her face as she perused the lists of ingredients and the steps for producing a soup. He imagined he could read her thoughts when he saw her lift her eyebrows and purse her lips in a little half smile. He found this expression erotic, and the sight filled him with anticipation, a soft, lingering pain that was all pleasure. When Mary Jane had decided what to make, she always assembled her ingredients on the kitchen island. There was a small cutting board she favored for slicing vegetables, and when her husband saw her reach for it, he took a stool on the opposite side of the island from his wife and tried to engage her in conversation. This made her laugh. "Can't you see I'm busy?" she said. He always said something like, "I want to tell you a joke I heard the other day." Then she pretended to ignore him while he told her some dirty story he'd probably already told her. When she took her favorite knife out of a drawer, he became silent. She peeled an onion and chopped it. The knife blade banged against the wooden board, as the odor of onion permeated the space between Mary Jane and her husband. She reached in the drawer again and found the vegetable peeler. She held up a big carrot for her husband's delectation before she began to slowly scrape it, leaving long orange strips in front of him on the counter. She polished a red bell pepper on her dress, taking particular care to rub it tenderly in the space between her breasts. Then she sliced off the top of the pepper and de-seeded it. When she began chopping it into little pieces, her husband's breathing slowed. By the time she held up a zucchini for him to see, he was panting. After Mary Jane added her vegetables and some broth to her pot, her husband made his desire plain by coming behind her and lifting her long hair and kissing the back of her neck. It was never long after this step in the ritual of soup making that Mary Jane and her husband found the opportunity to reconsecrate their union.
Wonderful. I told you I will leave the sex writing to you, Judy. Let's take some time to have questions.
No?
Yes.
This is the first time I've heard you read your prose and the first time I've read your prose, but I've heard you read your poetry and I've read your poetry before. And it seems like that you have the same economy of language and each sentence has like this big backstory to it. So I was wondering, is there any connection between the way you write poetry and the way you write prose?
Thank you. Thank you for asking.
So could you paraphrase that?
Yes. For sure. So the question is, there were comments about how Judy has the same economy of language in poetry and in her prose. And to just talk about, can you say that again? Sorry, the last part.
I was wondering, is there an approach or are the two styles of writing, do they influence each other in your work, the poetry and the prose? Or do you just go to one format for a particular form of expression and to the prose for a different style of storytelling?
So the question is to talk about the difference for you between writing poetry and writing prose. Is there a relationship between the two? And is that something you're conscious of when you're writing?
I think that Silvi keeps insisting on what I'm conscious of. But I can only be who I am. I can only do what I do. I think with poetry that there is a pressure. I feel a pressure. Good poetry is honest. And so there's a pressure there to tell the truth. But I have always felt that my poetry is too narrative, that it suffers from my strong sense of narrative. And I've talked to other poets about this, and particularly I remember Sharon Dubiago telling me, oh, I always worry about that too. So I don't know if it's a universal thing, but poetry and storytelling, I think, should be different. And in my case, they're closely related.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Judy.
Hi, Josh.
I have so many questions for you. I was thinking about if you and I were together later on, questions I would ask you about. I have a couple things in my mind, but let me keep it simple. When I was a busboy at the age of 17, I used to wait on a dear friend of yours, Bill King, who had a wife, Mrs. King. We'll refer to her as Mrs. King. And I was 17 and very influenceable at that time, and I wondered about people and their marriages. And these two people used to sit, and I would talk with them in a restaurant context. And I remember thinking how absolutely, they were older in years, how absolutely sexy her voice was. Like she had just this great grovelly So you're talking about marriages, and of course, everything in marriages and all relationships come down to communication. How important do you think it is for marriages and communication in general, as far as in a tonal quality or the influence behind it, or the sound, or otherwise? Go ahead and wax about Bill King, because all your Bill King stories are great.
Well, I can tell you, Josh, that I don't know how much sound has to do with marriage, if that was the question.
Yeah,
don't know.
well, I think the question is really to talk about communication in marriage, with a great story about how much an 18-year-old busboy was seduced by this woman's voice.
Yeah. She was a really lovely woman. She looked like Anne Bancroft, sort of an Anne Bancroft type, and always very decked out and very sexy. But I can tell you something about their liaison. First of all, they were not married for many, many years, and
Do you recommend that?
That's another question, Josh. Let me just finish by saying that he was a sportscaster, and he traveled with the Raiders, and later on with the A's, and he left continually, was leaving, and he never left that they didn't start scrapping with each other. And as he was walking out the door, she would yell, "Fuck you." And he would say, "Fuck you too." And then he would leave. Eric, it looks like you're...
No, but I think I'm going to turn this mic this way and try to finesse it a little bit, so that maybe the stream gets a little bit of those amazing stories. But don't rely on it. You'll have to repeat them.
Okay.
Yeah, that was Bill King. Great talker.
People have really different ways of communicating with each other. It's what works for some of us does not work for others.
And when Josh was 17, I wasn't a hell of a lot older than he was. And I remember being very shocked by the way that they communicated, although, they were as strong a couple as you'll ever meet. They were very devoted to one another and very, very much admired one another. But that was their way.
Josh does bring up an interesting point about, there's a way that people can be together for time, and then there's the marriage, right? You go make it official, you have all the tax stuff. Do you have opinions about whether or not making it official matters, changes the relationship?
Byron and I were together for 17 years before we married. We owned a house together. We worked together in his bookstore. We were together 24 hours a day. And I don't know if it's telling a story out of school, but one day we liked to drink. The bookstore was in San Rafael, and I hate to say it, but every bartender in San Rafael knew us. That was for sure. Anyway, we were sitting at the bar at San Rafael Joe's, which was a place where we often were, and Byron said to me, "Maybe we should get married."
Woo!
Yeah. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. We were getting along so well. I was very afraid to marry him. But you cannot live with someone for 17 years and say no when they ask you to get married. You just can't, believe me, you just can't do it. So that was it. I sometimes wonder if I should have tried to force him into something more romantic. But anyway, it was what it was. I'd say that our relationship shifted a little bit when we married. It did shift a little bit, as I had predicted, but it's kind of worked out in the end.
Kind of. Any other questions for Judy? Oh, way in the back. Sorry, it was dark.
Do you think couples who are opposites have a harder time than couples who are a lot like each other?
So the question is, do you think couples who are opposites have a harder time than couples who are a lot like each other?
Oh boy.
You play with this dynamic a lot.
Sorry.
It's great. It's a great question.
Yeah, no, it is. It is a great question. I don't know. I think probably the best thing. Byron is my third marriage, and I think probably the best thing is to marry someone that you met in church. And personally, I'm an atheist, but what I mean by that is that I think the easiest marriages are people who grow up in the same culture, are mostly the same age, maybe went to the same schools, went to the same church, and have a vocabulary, a shared vocabulary for communicating. And then some people, they begin in lust, and their lust lasts forever, and it doesn't matter if they even understand each other, apparently. So, it's just it's a good question.
Well, it makes me think of something you said to me ages ago, Judy, about relationship, which is that find someone who wants the same level of closeness, and that is what really makes a relationship last. I think it's some of the best relationship advice I've ever gotten. So to your point about, the lust that lasts, I mean, they want the same level of closeness, right?
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. Anyway, should we wrap this up?
Yeah. Unless there's any burning question. No? Okay.
It's good. You can email me if you want to know. Something you want to know. Thank you. Sylvia and I, we wanted to end by at least, bringing up something for Jack. And oddly enough, because I'm, if any of you don't know, a very, very dear friend of ours, Jack Hirschman, died this week. And the odd thing was that Sylvia and I decided to read the same poem. So I'm going to let her read the poem that we both chose, but I'll just do one in Jack's honor. And then Sylvia will finish. Will the poets keep quiet? No, they will not. They will not linger in the gloaming. They will not idle in the daybreak. They will not drowse at noon. The poets will speak. They will whisper to their lovers. They will talk among themselves. They will relate and orate and berate. They will traverse to converse and scramble to gabble. They will stop and chat about this and that. They will discuss what is old hat. They will rhyme and keep time. The poets will speak. They will scurry to the dais. They will lean upon the lectern. They will hold forth in the hall. They will hit and miss and flail and fail. They will proclaim and declaim and defame and inflame. The poets will pounce to pronounce. They will praise and amaze. They will search their souls for days. The poets will not keep quiet. The poets will speak.
So I have a little project where I write a poem a day, and every year I have a different theme. This year it's incomplete lists, and on Sunday I wrote an incomplete list that went like this. An incomplete list of reminders when you're experiencing loss. Grief does indeed has its way of holding on because it's so intimate with love. Now, when I wrote that, I thought, who am I writing this for and why now? And I thought about what Ram Dass says when he says that the heart is never not breaking because we're always breaking open. And I thought about one of the truest lines of poetry I have ever heard, which is from Jack Hirschman's poem Path. Brokenheartedness is the beginning of all real reception. And the thing about when I wrote this on Sunday and I didn't know who it was for is that I didn't know that Jack had died. And so when I found out on Monday, I thought, oh, this was for Jack. And of course, it was for all of us and the city of San Francisco, all of us who have lost him in body, but not in the words and the spirit and the books and the belief and the bravas and bravos that he leaves behind. And in this world, which is so much better for having had him in it. There are so many hearts that are surely broken open and broken apart by the loss of this revolutionary poet and our dear friend. It will always be with disbelief and wonder that in my years here in San Francisco, things went from Jack being a famous stranger, one of the first poets I ever saw read, to a supporter of my work, not just inviting me to read at the very library podium in which he stood, but also to take a seat next to him at Specs, next to his overspilling martini and kindness, his wet mustached kisses, and his terrible jokes. San Francisco will never be the same without Jack. And I wish that he may rest in peace and for him to know that he was like no other. And I thank him deeply for believing in me and for believing in all of us. Jack said in an interview about this poem that it embodies philosophically his belief in poetry and that it's for everybody because everybody is a poet. Path by Jack Hirschman. Go to your broken heart. If you think you don't have one, get one. To get one, be sincere. Learn sincerity of intent by letting life enter you because you're helpless, really, to do otherwise. Even as you try escaping, let it take you and tear you open like a letter sent, like a sentence inside you've waited all your life, though you've committed nothing. Let it send you up. Let it break you, heart. Broken-heartedness is the beginning of all real reception. The ear of humility hears beyond the gates, sees the gates opening. Feel your hands going akimbo on your hips, your mouth opening like a womb, giving birth to your voice for the first time. Go singing, whirling into the glory of being ecstatically simple. Write the poem. Thank you all so very much for being here, and thank you, Judy, for your beautiful work, and also for your presence in my life has really ushered in so many things, including Jack. I'm deeply grateful to you for that. Thank you, everyone, again for coming, and for those of you in TV land, please buy a book. And yeah, thanks. Have a great night. Judy, you're amazing.
Oh, thank you. You're amazing. You thought it went okay, I guess.
I feel like we need to record you reading these stories and put it out as an audio version.
Wouldn't cost much.
No.
How do we do it?
I just need to get a good microphone.
There is the bucket. And there are the books. So I'm going to put the bucket next to the books. The bucket has a hole in it. It's in the top where you put your money. All right.
How do you feel?
We need to get over there. Okay, she's gonna talk for a bunch. Yeah. Here, come with me.
How are you?
Unless you wanna say that, well, you'll
Seeing
get
good
her.
animals
You'll get her.
lately?
Oh, I've been seeing owls like every week.
I've heard. I saw an owl today, just in the middle of the day.
I gotta tell you something everywhere.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
How are you doing?
Good. Trying really hard on my job. And traveling a lot.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to just not worry. Good.
Oh, I didn't see you. How are you? So
You must
long.
be. Yeah.
I'll let you speak.
I was just gonna say, I just with you because the mask's my wedding anniversary. Now I realize.
Oh, who's saying?
So here I am.
Yes. Poor David.
When you actually got out of your car. And I was just saying that reason. Oh, I don't know my